For over 30 years, it was the obligatory weekly community event for kids. It was the showcase for new social trends, the arbiter of pop culture relevance, an exhibition of fantasies for an entire age group unsurpassed in the composition and density of relevant content broadcast from 8 a.m. to noon. Hi, I'm Dan Larson, and this is the history of Saturday morning cartoons. Which came first, the desire to do nothing but sit in front of the TV and watch cartoons, or the creation of the cartoons that inspired you to do nothing but sit in front of the TV and watch cartoons? From the 1960s to the mid-1990s, most kids didn't have much going on and no way to connect with each other except in person or on the phone. Hard to do that from the couch and/or if you just don't want to. After a week of school, your internal clock already had you getting up early. You weren't going to do anything productive without the application of force. A bowl of sugar cereal in your lap, fire up the television, and let the adventures begin. Spider-Man, Batman, Bugs Bunny, Scooby-Doo, Pac-Man, and hundreds of other pop culture icons, thousands of supporting cast members there for you. There to bring every kid together around a shared entertainment experience, a unified delivery system for every brand hoping to increase their visibility and market share that completely disappeared after having been a way of life for nearly 4 decades. Technically, television was invented in the late 1800s, but it wasn't a commercially viable product until the early 1900s, and even then it wasn't in widespread use until the late 1940s after World War II. It's the old problem of how do you sell a device when there is no content for it. TV was a curiosity, surely a thing that would be a big deal in the future, but until TV stations started broadcasting TV shows in the late 1920s and into the 30s, what were you going to do with it? An ad for Bulova watches aired on NBC in 1941, revenue generated by promoting a product during a broadcast. That's the real revolution for the way television would function for the next half a century. Through the 40s and 50s, black and white TVs were the standard. Color TV had been invented, but again, no one was broadcasting in color. It wasn't until the late 1950s into the early 1960s that enough color TVs were on the market and stations began broadcasting in color that cartoons could finally find their way from the cinema into your living room. The Flintstones debuted on ABC in 1960 as a primetime network series. Its initial run would last until 1966. That same year, The Bugs Bunny Show, a collection of animated shorts which had run in theaters ahead of feature films, debuted also in primetime, also on ABC. Fred Flintstone, Bugs Bunny, and other shows like The Jetsons, The Alvin Show, Beanie and Cecil, Tom and Jerry, Mighty Mouse, and Woody Woodpecker, all of these cartoons would see their success repeated when their episodes were rebroadcast on Saturday mornings, helping solidify that time slot as the time to target advertising dollars to the teens and under market specifically. All became longtime staples of Saturday morning. Through the 60s and into the 70s, several animation companies jumped into the original cartoon creation game. While cartoons and Saturday mornings had been popular for years, the idea of creating original content specifically for Saturday morning broadcast to assist in the exploitation of that time for creating revenue for the networks, that was new, that was innovative, that was the future. Animation had become a more affordable and more profitable alternative to live-action television. Actors could perform multiple roles. Reruns allowed for longer runs, spreading out the cost of the initial investment over a longer period of time. And the kids, they loved it. In the 1960s, televisions were found in more and more homes. The cost to own one decreased, and it moved from high-end status symbol to middle-class luxury item. Almost a necessary household appliance. It wasn't just for rich people anymore.
Hello, rich people, Troy's joining you. Yes, I'll hold.
If the 1960s made it clear that children were a specific targetable marketing group, something that could be sold to appropriate advertisers, the 1970s saw the perfection of that business model. And at that point, parents and educators got worried and began to explore whether this was actually a good thing that we, as a society of rational people, should be doing to our children. This was the first generation of kids growing up like this. Let's make sure we aren't doing any long-term damage. Researchers wanted to determine the effect all those hours in front of televisions and exposure to direct marketing was having on all these kids. What they found was that children did indeed have a difficult time understanding the difference between the entertainment portion of the program and the commercials running with it. They found that kids in general didn't really understand how manipulative commercials could be, how clever their creators were at creating demand for a product or an experience. Researchers and parents groups worried about the sustained exposure to animated violence and its normalizing effect. the direct pipeline of commercialism to children's brains, and during the 1970s, their voices were loud enough to get the federal government to implement some rules for the kind of content that cartoon studios could produce and air on network television. In 1978, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, considered a measure to outright ban all direct advertising to any children aged 6 and under. Instead, after what was probably an historic period of lobbying by groups representing the advertising industry, cartoon toy, and cereal producers, the networks were instead encouraged to balance out the content on their networks, maybe make some of the stuff educational and informational. And so began the continuous battle between marketers and television producers on one side trying to protect the freedom of the marketplace, and parents and concerned citizens on the other trying to protect, the kids from being preyed upon by those very smart adult business people. The Schoolhouse Rock series, a Saturday morning Hall of Famer, was a result of that government pressure, as well as other animated shorts like Time for Timer and the live-action One to Grow On series. Some networks took the additional step of creating actual news programs geared specifically for kids that broke down important news of the day, not just news that kids would be interested in.
Saturday mornings, turn on the fun, excitement, and adventures of all your favorite pals when Pac-Man drops in.
Yahoo! Hi-oh, PJ!
But that's not all.
Never fear!
Super Pac is here, followed by Rubik.
Rubik like to play!
With his mystical magic, Rubik the Amazing Cube. Then it's Menudo. And it's the Littles jumping into big adventures.
Better hold on to me, Lucy.
Saturday Sparkle.
The 1980s would be the peak for Saturday morning cartoons. Total indulgence, total mastery of the model. Cartoons as entertainment, yes, but also as advertisement themselves. Partnerships between animation studios and toy companies, video game producers, every potential product tie-in that could be exploited into or out of a cartoon was in play. Almost nothing was created that didn't have the ulterior motive of selling additional products. It was the time that some of the concerns of the researchers and parents groups did come true. I mean, this channel, this stuff, the major brands that are still driving Hollywood right now are all the brands that took root in the 80s. The programs worked. Customers for life. But the 80s are also when the indulgences reached too far, when cracks started to show in the foundation. Daily syndicated cartoons like G.I. Joe and Transformers started to splinter the focused marketing appeal of Saturday mornings. Weekdays didn't have the same degree of rules that Saturday mornings had. The audience was beginning to spread out and break up. Not to mention video game consoles and home video systems demanding a greater share of consumers' attention. TV was losing its monopoly on eyeball time, and Saturday mornings were one of the first victims. In 1990, the federal government took direct, formal action to intervene in the way that children's television programming had evolved. Known as the Kid Vid Rules, the Children's Television Act of 1990 set to increase the quality of educational and informational broadcast television programming for children, end quote. They wanted to find a balance between the type of programs that had been produced and programming that furthers the positive development of children 16 years of age and under in any respect, including the child's intellectual and cognitive or social and emotional needs. End quote. Studies at the time showed that kids 2 to 17 watched over 3 hours of television per day and estimated that by the time they were 18, they would have watched between 15,000 and 20,000 hours of television, which, I gotta say, sounds quaint by today's YouTube, Twitch, and Netflix standards. Television absolutely had a significant impact on children. Studies showed that more than 2/3 of kids and their contemporaries were influenced by what they saw on television. 60% of the kids said that television had a negative impact on values such as disrespect for parents and having sex at too young an age. 82% admitted television should teach right from wrong. Which one of you 40-year-olds sold us out? Start talking. Congress decided that we as a society were responsible for what our kids were watching and that television had the capability to, quote, benefit society and assist in educating and informing children. Television can effectively teach children specific skills, assisting in preparing children for formal schooling, as well as complement skills taught in the classroom, end quote. Congress also noted that, quote, market forces alone had not produced an adequate amount of children's educational and informational programming on commercial television and that government action was needed to increase the availability of such programming, end quote. So in 1991, the FCC put regulations in place that would require networks to increase the amount of educational and informational programming for kids, and attempt to ensure that advertisements for stuff related to specific cartoons were not broadcast during that specific cartoon. But let's be clear about one thing. Educational and informational content is not, in and of itself, a bad thing. In fact, you're soaking in it right now. Just a few years later, in 1995, the FCC attempted to strengthen the CTA since it seemed the broadcasters weren't actually taking the 1990 regulations seriously. The FCC proposed that stations be required to air a minimum of 3 hours of children's educational programming per week. Networks, of course, pushed back against these accusations, arguing that many of them were already in compliance, if not exceeding the required amount of educational and informational content, admittedly working within the gray area of subjectivity as to what could really be considered educational and informational. Could one argue that Batman is technically an educational show? Were the Ghostbusters informational? How wholesome and moral were the Transformers? In 1996, Congress implemented the Children's Programming Report, chock full of new regulations and obligations, clarified what actually did count as educational, set the specific age demographic range at 16 and younger, and codified the requirement that all commercial television stations had to broadcast at least 3 hours of regularly scheduled content per week between the hours of 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. As of January 2nd, 1997, stations had to label those shows on air and provide appropriate information to the TV listing providers. Oh, and it goes on. They had to put together and publish a quarterly public report that covered everything they had aired the previous quarter and what their plans were for the upcoming quarter. They needed a point of contact established for viewers to reach out to with questions or concerns, additional costs, additional responsibilities, additional potential places where they could unintentionally violate a federal regulation and risk a fine. Of course, fair or not, none of that applied to cable TV, which, along with these new regulations and several other factors, would hasten the end of Saturday morning cartoons. Look, there's a lot of reasons why Saturday morning cartoons didn't survive. It's easy to say government regulations killed it, but that's not the whole story. Yes, regulations were a part of it, but so was the growth of cable, the growth of home video, the growth of video game consoles, the shift of animation resources back to the theater in the early 90s, as it proved to be a greater return on investment. And regardless of what happened, the landscape today in 2018 would have ultimately killed it or forced it to change into something else anyway. Any kind of content, cartoons or otherwise, is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The consumer is empowered, for better or for worse, to seek out their own source of entertainment at the time of their choosing with the subject matter of their choosing. The choices are now made by the holders of the technology, which is simultaneously awesome and one of the worst things ever conceived of by humans. If you wonder why broadcast animation isn't what it used to be, it's because there is no economically viable formula anymore, no single place to collect those advertising revenue dollars. Things have to be less expensive to produce than ever, shorter with a wider audience. Unless, of course, you are a historically well-performing mega brand with global awareness like Star Wars, Transformers, Marvel superheroes, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or Toy Galaxy. Saturday morning cartoons dominated the only time in history that they could have. Corporate America used it to sell their brands, kids used it for its escapism and brilliance of imaginative characters, stories, and adventures. While the cartoons they showed were the feature, the real importance to both sides of the screen was the convergence of everyone around a single entertainment source, leading to a shared experience. Saturday morning cartoons were a cultural phenomenon that emerged organically from the growth of a revolutionary technology and the habits of the consumers who engaged with it. It was a collaboration of individual networks, advertisers, and artists conspiring to compel a specific demographic to advocate for targeted redistribution of their parents' financial resources. Yes, but it was also a lot of fun. Thanks for watching. Please hit like, hit subscribe. If you're not already a subscriber, thank you very much to those of you who are. Please share this video, and if you're in the position to help the channel grow, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/toygalaxy and let us know if you were part of the Saturday morning cartoon generation, or even if you just watched cartoons on Saturday mornings like last weekend, like on a device or something. It doesn't have to be 30 years ago. Hey, you know what we don't rehearse? The end slates.